This story was written by Kim Lindgren. My grandmother, when she was alive, lived on an old farm on the side of a hill in a remote village in northern Sweden, right next to a beautiful lake surrounded by mountains. Whenever we were there, we would spend all day swimming or fishing for perch and crayfish. Grandmother was, however, always very assertive that we must never get out on the lake during the night, though she never gave us any reason. I always assumed she worried that something would happen while no one was around to help. But of course, time passes, and last year so did my grandmother. My grandfather died when I was very young, so my grandmother's passing left the house empty, and neither my mother nor any of her siblings were interested in moving out to the middle of nowhere. I, on the other hand, work remotely most of the time, and even though I don't really expect to work the land, the solitude sounded quite appealing. Along with the house itself, I inherited furniture, a tractor, some old farming equipment, and, of course, the small wooden rowing boat we would use whenever we were visiting. I have a single neighbor, a strange old man named Leonard, who lives in a small cottage further up the hill across the road from me. He mostly likes to keep to himself, but I have offered to let him use the boat if he wants to do some fishing and to help out with clearing snow during the winter. One night after I'd finally settled in and was mostly unpacked, I stood by the window in my bedroom looking out over the lake. The moon was peeking out over the mountain opposite and cast a beautiful glow on the still water. And suddenly, I was reminded of my grandmother's warnings not to go out on the lake during the night. Curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way down to the boathouse. As I made my way down to the lake, I heard footsteps and a voice calling out behind me. Startled, I turned around to see Leonard. He seemed flustered and asked me, almost accusingly, why I was going down to the boathouse at this hour. Confused and a little annoyed at his sudden intrusion, I told him that I felt like taking the boat out for a little midnight trip since this was such a beautiful night. He insisted that going out on the lake during the night was unsafe. Had my grandmother not warned me? In hindsight, I feel extremely childish about this, but his insistence just made me more motivated. I told him that I was fully aware of the risks of taking a boat out at night, but that I was a grown adult and capable of making my own decisions. Leonard grumbled, and I could tell that he was still very agitated. But he relented, and with a grunt and a dismissive wave, started making his way back up the hill. I pushed my boat out on the water and jumped in. The water was very still, and the combination of the moonlight and the almost complete absence of any sounds made for an incredibly soothing experience. I settled around the middle of the lake, perhaps 300 meters from the shore. At this point, I could see most of the houses in the village and the neighboring village. Looking over toward my house, I suddenly realized that Leonard's cottage was entirely dark. He usually had some lights on in the windows, so that was certainly odd, but I could only assume that he had blown a fuse. Around me, the stillness of the water was disturbed by bubbles, and before I knew it, the water was filled with frenzied activity, and with a lurch, the boat suddenly started moving back towards the shore. I was moving significantly faster than my rowing had taken me out onto the lake, and I was holding on for dear life. I was worried I would crash into the boathouse, But whatever pushed my boat along navigated it safely back to the spot where I would normally keep it moored, and it slid softly back onto land. I stood up, scared and confused, and looked around. 3 dark and bloated silhouettes emerged from the water. In the moonlight, they looked almost like soldiers in ghillie suits, but they clearly wore no diving equipment. They approached swiftly and grabbed me. The creatures smelled vaguely of fish and decaying vegetation, and they spoke in a language I could not comprehend. I managed to make out a single word that was repeated multiple times. Murmelgard. They dragged me inside the boathouse. One of them looked me dead in the eyes and covered my mouth as it made a gargled, hushing sound. Its face was clearly not human, with bulging eyes without eyelids, 2 slits in place of a nose, and no visible ears. I realized that it was, in fact, not wearing anything. However, its leathery dark brown skin seemed to mimic the appearance of decaying leaves. Of course, I was scared nearly out of my mind at this point. But for some reason, I didn't attempt to flee. The creatures seemed almost as scared as I was. So, I complied and kept quiet. They turned off the lights and settled down around me. We waited in there for what felt like an eternity, but was most likely only a couple of minutes. The silence outside was suddenly broken by a loud splash and the sound of wood splintering. I could hear that something was emerging from the lake, followed by heavy, damp footsteps. From what I could tell, it seemed to be moving up the hill as the footsteps were getting more and more distant. As I sat in that boathouse, my senses turned to max by all of the adrenaline coursing through my body. The sounds of breaking glass and splintering wood reached us. Eventually, the footsteps returned, and whatever had come after us out of the lake made its way back into the water. A couple of minutes later, the 3 creatures that brought me into the boathouse quietly exchanged a few words. The one that had hushed me earlier gestured that I was free to leave, and then they left. I could hear them going back into the water. I fell back against the wall and slid down to the floor as my adrenaline abated and the fear truly set in. I didn't move from that spot until the following morning. My house looked like a crime scene. The front door, along with its frame, had been torn out of the wall and lay several meters away on my lawn. Most of my windows and furniture was in pieces, and pools of water dotted the floor throughout the house. Leonard clearly knew more about the creatures that live in the lake. I resented that he hadn't been more forceful in stopping me from going out in the boat. However, logically, I knew I wouldn't have believed him if he had started going on about monsters. And what was he supposed to do? Nevertheless, I marched over to his cottage and banged on the door until he eventually opened it. He seemed both surprised and relieved that I was standing there, and he offered me a cup of coffee and an explanation. The lake is inhabited by a creature known as Murmelgard, and creatures known as the Vatnora. Generally, they live together in peace, but they have very different opinions on us humans. Leonard and my grandmother used to spend time with the Vatnora, and they understood some of their language. Their word for human roughly translates as foolish ones. They say that humanity are not mature, and they mostly settle with observing us. Murmelgard is an ancient creature that sleeps during the day and hunts at night. He is resentful of humanity for settling around his lake, eating his fish, and disturbing the darkness of the night with artificial lights. I still live in my grandmother's old house, and Leonard has promised to introduce me to the Vatnora in their own time. I feel an obligation to thank them and to protect others from Myrmelgard. I will never go out on the lake during the night again, but I feel strangely safe to do so during the day. This story was written by Boris Bacic. I took the elevator in my office to the ground floor like I do every day. It's a large building, with my office being on the 12th floor, so walking up and down just doesn't seem that appealing to a man with my stamina. Usually, the elevator is slow, making a few stops along the way. But what bothers me more is the fact that the elevator always seems to evade me by going all the way up, down, opposite of where I am just before I press the call button. Yesterday, I was in the elevator with around 5 people who had to get out on the way down. The last person got out on the 5th floor, leaving me alone in the elevator. However, instead of continuing to go down, the elevator suddenly started going up. Great, I thought. I must have forgotten to press the ground floor button, and now I have to go up again. The elevator stopped shortly after, but I was greeted with an unfamiliar sight. A vast, empty space of rooms, with dilapidated white walls, old neon lights, and a concrete floor with cracks in places. I thought this must have been some unused office floor which was under renovation or construction. As I stepped forward to check where I was, the elevator closed behind me, and I was left alone on the floor. There was no way I would wait for it to come back again, so I decided to find the staircase and make my way down. The rooms seemed to be expanding in various directions, so I took the one on the left, since it felt more natural to me. I passed through one room, then 2, then 3, and then it hit me. Something which made my dread rise like boiling water. The rooms continued expanding in all directions. Since I was going left and the elevator was very close to the front of the building, I should have run into a wall by now. But there were none. Not even windows. Panicking, I made a dash back to where I came from, but it was impossible to find my way around this maze. "Hello?" I shouted with a cracked voice. "Is anyone here?" All that followed was the buzzing of the neon lights. But then I heard something else. I steadied my breathing and heard what sounded like footsteps upon the concrete floor, echoing somewhere close to me. "Hello? Who's there? Please, I need help." The footsteps sounded like they were getting closer, but due to the echo, it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. A flood of relief washed over me as I realized I wasn't alone here. "Hey, I'm right here, buddy," I shouted. Thank God. I thought I was going to be lost here forever. My phone suddenly vibrated. I pulled it out, scolding myself for not using it earlier. There was a text message from an unknown number. It said, "Stay away from them." The footsteps that were slow and deliberate earlier now turned into a frantic sprint. I didn't wait to see who or what was there. but the sudden feeling of being caught by something predatory made me run faster than I ever thought imaginable. I didn't care where I was running. I just ran through room after room, praying to every god that exists to grant me freedom or a quick death, while those footsteps kept following me the whole time. Never closer, and never more distant. My chest and legs were burning, but the fear and adrenaline prevented me from stopping. And then, as if on cue, I suddenly saw an elevator in front of me. It opened as I was running toward it, and in that panicked moment, something in the back of my mind told me that this one could lead to an even worse place. But I didn't care. I could hear the thing behind me closing in, and I ran into the elevator so quickly that I practically rammed the wall of it and collapsed to the floor. Just as the doors of the elevator started closing, I heard a blood-curdled scream, impossible to be made by any human or animal alive, before it bumped into the closed elevator doors with such force that the whole elevator shook. I didn't even need to press the button before the elevator started descending, and I heard one final short screech of whatever was on that floor, echoing around the elevator before it became silent completely. And then the elevator stopped, and the distinctive ding of the doors opening sounded itself. "Let's take the stairs." 2 women stood in front of the elevator, looking at me in disgust. Before I could process what was going on, they were gone, and the doors of the elevator started closing again. I scrambled, forcing my hand through the gap, making the doors open again. At the bewilderment of everyone in the building, I ran out of there as fast as I could, happy to feel the fresh air on my face again. I'm glad I didn't turn around to face what was chasing me. Something tells me if I did, I would have been so petrified with fear that it would be able to catch up and tear me to pieces instantly. I haven't used an elevator since then. 12th floor or not, I walk up to my office. And everywhere else. This story was written by The No Exit Room. I've always believed that true horror lives in silence. Not in screams or blood, but in that exact moment when you realize something's wrong, and it's already too late to fix it. It started last September. I had moved to a small town in western Kentucky for a clinical rotation. Housing was expensive, so I rented an old trailer, parked in the backyard of a retired couple, Tom and Lori. The trailer sat near a tree line that bordered the forest. They told me someone used to live there full time, but the last tenant had left suddenly. I didn't ask questions. All I needed was a bed, an outlet for my laptop, and some peace and quiet. The first 2 weeks were uneventful. The trailer creaked in the wind, the heater moaned like an old fridge, and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's dog barking at night. Nothing unusual. But then, just before 3 a.m. one night, I woke up to a sound. Not at the door, but on the side of the trailer. 3 soft knocks. A pause. Then again. I froze. My phone said 2:37 a.m., and I lay there, listening, heart pounding. And after a minute, the knocking stopped. I told myself it was probably just a branch, maybe a raccoon. But the next night, it happened again. By the third night, I wasn't sleeping. Lights off, phone in hand. I waited. The knocking came again. 3 deliberate taps on the back wall. Not random, not wind. Deliberate. It felt personal. Like someone wasn't saying, "I'm here." They were saying, "Aren't you scared yet?" The next morning, I checked the siding. No branches nearby. Back window, too high for any animal. And that feeling, it was growing. I casually asked Lori what happened to the last tenant. She looked away. Tom just muttered, "Oh, he didn't last long. Young guy, kept to himself. Kinda like you." That stuck with me. Soon I started noticing things. Smudged fingerprints on a window I never touched. A coffee mug moved slightly. Nothing big, just enough to make me doubt myself. I began recording short videos at night. Not for proof, but for sanity. Then one night, I woke to a whisper. But this time, it was coming from inside the trailer. From the bathroom. I grabbed my flashlight, and I slowly opened the door. Nothing. But on the mirror, written with a finger, were the words, "He's lying." And that was enough. The next morning, I packed my things. Tom didn't ask why. He just nodded and said, "No one stays long." I moved a few hours away. New apartment. Bright. Normal. But the trailer, it stayed with me. The knocks, the mirror, the voice. After a few days, I needed answers. So I sent a letter to the local library. I gave them the trailer's address, the owner's names, and asked if they had any archived newspaper articles. A few days later, a librarian named Grace replied, "I've sent you a few articles, but I'd recommend not coming back here." Inside the envelope was a faded clipping. The headline read, "Local woman found dead behind rental trailer. Foul play suspected." Her name was Leah Grayson. She had lived in the trailer before me. The cause of death? Sleeping pill overdose. But the article said she never purchased any meds herself. And neighbors said she often spoke of voices, someone calling to her at night. But what chilled me most was a small note at the bottom of the page. Years prior, the owner's daughter, Alice Laurie, was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and had lived in the same trailer. After a relapse, she was kept under home supervision. Further details undisclosed. Alice. She must have still been there, hiding, wandering, watching. Maybe she and Leah had met. Maybe things got out of hand. Tom and Lori, they stayed silent. Maybe they thought they were protecting her. Maybe they were just afraid. I watched one of my videos again. Late night, dark frame. At 2:36 a.m., the backyard gate creaks open. A figure enters. Thin, wearing a long sweater. She stands there, motionless, 2 full minutes, then turns and walks back into the trees. No ghosts, no demons, just someone forgotten, left untreated, wandering in the dark. Even knowing that, I still freeze whenever I hear 3 soft taps on the window. Because even now, I'm not sure it's just her.